It's summer here in New Zealand, and the first thing that comes out, of course, is the fans that have been packed away over winter. I brought this one out into the lounge yesterday because it's not hot enough yet to use the heat pump, so a little fan just stirs the air around and keeps things nice and cool. This is what happens when you switch it on. The answer is you can just about see the fan blades just trying to move. I don't think that's going to move fast enough to cool the air down at all. This particular one is under the Moretti name, but you will find identical fans to this under thousands of different names. They're a very simple motor, and you basically have a 3-position switch, apart from off, of course, low, medium and high. And it achieves its speed regulation by changing the number of poles on the motor. There's no electronics involved whatsoever. Now generally these things are not very good, to put a fine point on it, but they are cheap. I think this one was about 39 New Zealand dollars. But typically they will only last 1, maybe 2 seasons, because the biggest problem is the bearings on the motor. It's very rare in my experience that the motor physically fails, i.e. electrically fails, burns out or goes open circuit or whatever. It's always the bearings. But saying that, I'm about to take it apart and show you how easy or how difficult it is to remedy the situation. The first thing you'll need to do is take the cover off, and this is done simply here. There's a simple nut and bolt which you have to remove. Right, that's the nut and bolt off, and now there are numerous clips around the outside which you simply lift off. And that should, oh, one more, and then the top just lifts off, and it's obvious that the bearing has dried out. The next stage is to remove the fan blade, which is simply unscrew this. Now it's actually the wrong way round to what you would think it is. That would normally be anti-clockwise, but you actually have to turn it the wrong way, if that makes sense. It's simply so the fan doesn't come unscrewed when you're actually using it. But that might say, it does actually say on there, tighten or loosen. But if you're like me, you always try these things first and then read it afterwards. We just pop the fan off. Next stage is to remove this nut, again, which is just finger tight, very loose as it happens, and then that should allow that to come off. Now there is a temptation to just drop a few drops of oil, laying it on its back and drop a few drops of oil. Now that won't really work. It'll be a short-term fix, because if you use an oil like 3-in-1, it will clear that front bearing, but the oil is too thin, so you'll find a day or so later you'll be back to where you started. Plus that doesn't address the bearing on the back. So the next thing we need to do is remove these 4 screws. Right, the screws are loose there, so that should just slide off, and try not to lose the screws in the process. Now to make things easier, it's now laying on its side, and I'm going to remove this screw here because I want to detach the motor from the base because it's very unwieldy at present. Right, that's unconnected, so the screw should now just pull out, which it does, and we're now in pieces. Now we've got to get this off, and you'd think it would be easy just to pull it off, but it isn't. Well, I did that off camera because there was quite a lot of bad language and I didn't want to have to censor it, but basically I had to use to lever it and get that off. It's only a push fit, but it was one hell of a job to get off. Now by rights, the motor should now just pull forward. I cannot see where it's linked to anything, but it does not want to come out. And I don't know why. Now I think we found under this little cover there's probably a screw. And what do we find? A screw. Now that's a good reason why it won't come out. But I've never taken one of these apart before, so it's as new to me as it possibly is for you. So now all will be revealed, I think. The screw should come out. Yes, there we go. And now the motor should just come out. And there we have it. This is the little box that has the gearing in it to swivel the fan backwards and forwards, which is all screwed to that. So the next job is going to be to have to remove that. At least that potentially looks easy. There's one, two, and another screw under there. So we'll remove those and see where we go from there. Right, screws undone. So that should now just lift out. And yes, we expose the worm drive. So I think we may be able to get at it now. Considering the bearings are dry, there's a remarkable amount of liquid oil around, and I'm getting covered in it. Now I suspect that is the problem, because the bearings have been oiled and they should have been greased, because the very nature of the fan, if you think about it, is drying out the bearings. And if the oil is very runny or of low viscosity even, the oil will just dry out and the unit will become useless, which is exactly what's happened. So somehow we've got to pack some grease into here, and I think we may end up having to take the motor apart. Now, as this is a purely mechanical device, or the repair at least is a mechanical one, we don't want to interfere with any of the wiring or anything like that. So as far as possible, I'm going to leave it all connected. But we do need to take off these parts of the motor, and there are 4 screws, nuts and bolts, which I'm now going to remove, and that should allow the end caps to come off and expose the bearings. Now this is one of the 4 nuts and bolts that came off, but note there is a small shake-proof washer on there, and what I always do is just put the nut on the end, so because if you lose that, you can spend the next 5 years of your life crawling around on the floor trying to find it. Right, the 4 bolts are out, and now it should just come apart, but we'll use a little bit of persuasion. We'll just turn this. There we go. Just needed something to get it started. We should be able to pull the motor apart now. I'll try and do it so you can see what's going on. Now the limit, I think we're going to have to take this off. We're a little bit stuck because it's all joined together, but I've unscrewed that, and that should now just lift off. Yep. So now we should be able to separate the motor. I don't think there's anything holding that. Well, that's as far as we can go that end, simply because we've got a pin in there. I could remove it. We will see if we actually need to presently. Now it's debatable that it's actually worth repairing this, because the bearings are just basically a sleeve. In an ideal world they'd be made of phosphor bronze or a ball race. Now this is one of the shafts that slide through it, and there is really hard sticky grease on there which I'm going to have to remove. They've obviously not used a high temperature grease, and that's one of the reasons it's failed. But we're going to clean that and do it properly. But the bearings themselves are just a sleeve. So other than cleaning them and repacking them, it's still not going to last. Now, different people have different ways of cleaning, but I like to use isopropyl alcohol, if the camera will focus, together with a cotton bud. And this should get this off nicely. Look at the mess. I shan't bore you having to watch me clean everything, but this is basically what you have to do. And the same with the end bearings, isopropyl and cotton buds. And when you don't get any more off, it's clean. And this is one of the units where I'm going to add a little bit of grease, and just inside here, because it's just the worm drive which rotates the fan left and right. It's pretty dry at the moment, so I should just get a cotton bud. In fact, I should use a cotton bud for all these processes. Basically, this is just common sense. There is the bearing, such as it is. So a little bit of grease around the inside of that, and the same this end. I don't think it's worth taking that bearing out, because what I shall do is put the grease on the shaft here and slide it backwards and forward. I've cleaned it out already, and then just lightly lubricate the areas here is where it looks like most of the force goes, because that's where most of the gunge was, and you can see it's slightly scored. It looks dirty, but it's not. It's actually where the bearing has been worn, basically, and that's in a year. So it shows you what junk this stuff is. What you need to do at this stage is be very careful of the windings. Don't distort them or squeeze them or do anything to them, because if they are distorted, you could risk shorting it either to the motor case or actually damaging the windings themselves. And if that's the case, you might as well just throw it away now. Right, we're now lubricating the front bearing, and what I've done is to slide the shaft out and cover the shaft in this grease and slide it backwards and forwards. It feels better already. And when this is finished, this motor will be up here. So any spare on the shaft here, we'll just simply remove that. And we'll do a very similar thing in the back bearing. I've already lubricated this one, so there's just this end one to do now. So I should use the cotton bud to go on the inside, like so, but do it properly. Right, that's the final shaft, which I've now coated in the magic blue gunk, and I've also lubricated this worm drive here, and so everything is now completely lubricated, and we'll put it back together again now. Right, it's all gone back together remarkably well. So before we completely put it back together in the fan, I'm going to put some volts on it, probably about 240, and we'll see what happens. So it's plugged in, and let's see. There we go. Everything seems to be going round. There's a little device on the worm which goes round to rotate it. It's buzzing a bit, but that's purely because it's on this surface. If I lift it clear, it goes quiet. The reassembly is going quite well. I did have a bit of an issue with this lock nut here, because the knot dropped down inside, and it took me 10 minutes of shaking and banging and tapping and a fair bit of abuse to get the thing out. Before you put the final bits back together, make sure these nuts and bolts are really tight, because if you don't, apart from the fact it won't necessarily run true, you'll find you'll get vibration from the laminations of the motor, which will drive you mad. And you'll only have to do it again, so you might as well do it properly the first time. Well, it's nearly all put back together. All the speeds work. And slow. All I've got to do now is put that on slow for a minute. All I've got to do now is put the outer cover on. Now, it does vibrate quite a bit, this fan, and always has done. There is a little thing just inside there, a little weight, which I might experiment with to see if I can balance it a bit better. But they're basically a piece of junk, and there's not much you can do about it. But we'll have a go. Well, I've tried it already with no weight, and that clearly makes it worse. So I've numbered the markings, or whatever they are, and we'll see which one. I've now put it in position 1. That was the original position, and we'll see where we go from there. Well, after trying it on every single position, it just makes it vibrate even more unevenly. So I've actually put it back in the position that it was in to start with. So it looks like the manufacturers have made a half-hearted attempt at balancing it. But I suppose they probably had about 8 seconds to do it. And if I cared to mess about with it and add bits of weight, but it runs at the high speed without vibration, so it's no worse than it ever was. Well, it's all back together and working, and seems to be working pretty well. Let's just stop that for a minute so you can hear what I'm saying. You can see the bearings are somewhat better now. Before, you saw it wouldn't even turn. So to sum up, these fans are sold all over the world under many, many different names, but they're all very similar, and remarkably the price varies by about 30–40%. So we paid about 39 New Zealand dollars for this, but it won't last. Over the last 5 or 6 years we've had probably 4 or 5 of these, and most end up in the bin. And for $39, would I do it again? Plus, as I said, the bearing is rubbish. It won't last. So unless every year or so you want to take it all apart and get covered in grease, I don't think I'd buy any more. Right, that's the job finished. As you can see, it's a beautiful day. I do not intend to spend any more time getting covered in grease over a epoxy $39 fan. So it's up to you if you're going to buy one or not. Thanks for watching.